Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly, and voila! You get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello, and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. Today, like always, we bring you fascinating topics from fascinating guests. Today, I have with me Dino Zincarini from Turetsky Consulting. Hello, Dino.
Hello.
And I have Stacey Harris from Sapient Insights Group. She is the Chief Research Officer. Hello. How are you, Stacey?
Hi, I'm doing well today. Thanks for having me, David.
Thank you. So if you don't know Stacey, let me tell you a little bit about her. She's not only the Chief Research Officer, but for the last, 23 years, you've done the annual HR Systems Survey. Is that correct? And you're going in your 24th year?
We're going into 24th year, yes. Yeah. So our organization has run this research for the last 24 years. I have only done it for 10 years, because if I'd have done it for 24 years, that would have made me 3 when I started, right?
Yes.
But
right.
no, before me, many people know Lexi Martin. She ran it for 17 years before me. So it's been a labor of love for both of us for a very long time. Yeah.
Sure. And if anybody hadn't heard Stacey talk about it, I think all of us had been enraptured by her as a keynote speaker at the HR technology conferences. So if you haven't, please, I beg you, go listen to Stacey talk at the HR technology conference. And you could probably find those recorded on the web somewhere, right, Stacey?
Yeah, we have a couple snippets of them on our sapientinsights.group.com website.
Okay.
And then, yes, I believe the HR Tech Conference does replay them for several months after the events. Yeah.
So what I might ask you to do is if you could provide us with those links, we'll put them directly in the podcast notes so that people can access them.
Definitely. Yep.
Awesome. For those of you who know Stacey, you may not know this, but Stacey is a wicked high elf in D&D and throws a nasty fireball. That is absolutely cool, Stacey.
Yes, it's a
No comment?
No. I'm commenting. I'm laughing while I'm talking about it. So I have 2 boys, 26 and 22 right now. And early on, we realized that, one of the things that they loved to do was geek out on D&D. And I loved storytelling. That was one of the things we did very much when they were growing up. And so as a family sort of get together about 5 years ago, we started this annual sort of family D&D that we do at Thanksgiving and Christmas and all the events. And we bring together all the cousins and we bring together. And I have found that I love it. It's such a great way to connect with people from, we have family all over the world, to connect with people all over the world and spend time. And we laugh and we have amazing stories about, wizards and dragons. And my son is the dungeon master and he's great at it. So yes, it's a very fun thing.
And for those of you who don't know D&D and think it's just a total geek thing, it really isn't. It's a beautiful thing where there's a ton of creativity involved. And my son is my inspiration on D&D. So I have to shout out to Nathan, who, if he ever does hear this, he'll hopefully be proud. But he has kind of brought that into our lives because he is a dungeon master himself and loves it. So, and I know, Dino, you love D&D too, don't you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think the geek is strong in all of us.
It is. So today we're going to do things a little differently. Today, I'm going to turn things over to Dino and have Dino and Stacey have the conversation that they were wanting to have for a long time. Dino, let me hand it over to you to talk about what topic we're going to talk about today.
Hello, this is Michael Vandervoort from the Drive Through HR podcast, where we discuss ideas, trends, and activities that impact HR, talent, HR technology in the workplace. Our focus is on expanding knowledge and igniting curiosity as we hear directly from people who are shaping the future of the HR industry. Join us.
Sure. I think, what I wanted to talk about when I heard about your background and what you're doing, Stacey, is just to kind of take a step back and let's talk about the state of HR tech in the world today. I've been on the vendor side now for over a decade, and I've gone to a lot of HR tech conferences. And what always struck me about it was how every one of them, there seems to be a new thing, a new theme, a new technology. And everyone's very excited about that technology, but it's changing a lot. So what are your observations right now? Where are we right now? Is there a tech theme to what's going on right now? And what are your observations on that?
Well, this is a great topic, by the way, Dino, because and particularly relevant for me and the work that I do with the Sierra or with the Sapient Insights Group research, because we have been doing this research, which is a very practical look at what happens in the HR technology space for 24 years. And when you look at the market year over year, the hype gets sort of washed out because you actually start to see what's happening. So, for example, I think there is an expectation that the whole world is sitting in cloud technology. In all reality, although yes, the world is mostly cloud HR technology, about 40% of organizations still have an on-premise application somewhere in their system, right? Most people wouldn't even consider that. And that was a huge impact in the last 12 months because of the COVID-19 crisis and the fact that organizations were trying to work from home, and all that on-premise technology caused some real challenges for many of those organizations. The other thing I think that we're seeing with this constant hype in the HR technology space is the need to always focus on newer recruiting tools, newer engagement platforms, newer, front-end solutions. And I don't disagree that that's an important conversation to be having in your ecosystem, but it is just as important as really rethinking your payroll and your benefits applications and your reporting tools. So many times organizations try and fix an underlying HR process or systems issue by putting a really pretty face cover on it, right? And not really taking a look at the fact that their payroll system has an opportunity to be upgraded or needs to be adjusted, or even that they haven't made all the updates they need to make in their current HRMS system. Many times if they haven't gone through, and even if they're in a cloud environment, they might do an upgrade, but they haven't approved all of those upgrades and rolled them out to everyone. So we see a lot of that in the market. And so if I had one theme that came out this year, I would say that HR is an ecosystem of technology, and you have to treat it as such, which means it has life cycles. It has places where you need to constantly manage and maintain your data. It means you have to really think about who's feeding the data into it, how the data is coming out of it. And you have to really think about what is the goal you're trying to achieve? What's the outcome you're trying to get? So many times we think HR systems are just about putting in place a good process, but there's real outcomes we're trying to achieve as businesses, and HR systems are supposed to help us do that. So those are my big things when I think about getting out of the hype cycle, if you want to call it.
Stacey, one of the things you talked about there was the new stuff that comes out. And, I think of it like the squirrel technique that dogs have, where their attention is on something and then all of a sudden something comes their way, like shiny new object. I mean, I know HR suffers from this like every other industry does, where something comes out, it's new, it's shiny, and they kind of gravitate toward it for a little bit. And then another shiny new thing comes along. When you talk about the kind of the debt that a lot of these HR systems have, what do we owe to that shiny object syndrome or the squirrel syndrome that HR has kind of adapted to?
Yeah, that's a really great sort of, way of sort of describing what is happening in the HR technology space, and really all of technology, right? How many times have we stood in line to get the new iPhone or had to have the newest watch? I've got 3 iWatches sitting on my desk. Yeah, exactly. Because the last one just didn't last as long, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think particularly here in the United States, but really it's a global phenomenon that we're just excited by new and something that just feels like it was designed in this last century, right? What I think the challenge is for the HR space in doing that is we oftentimes forget that the experience that the end user has doesn't start and end with the interaction in on their watch or in their screen on the computer or in their phone. It begins and ends with the data and whether or not it's right. And you can't get good data if you're not addressing the underlying systems. And so for us, when we look at a lot of the times, people tell us all the time in our research, we have a user experience and a vendor satisfaction rating, and you'd be surprised by how tightly connected those two factors are. And generally the user experience challenges that organizations have really have to do with integration issues or lack of the ability to sort of get the data into the system the way we need to get it, or too many screens for someone to fill out, or too many. So it doesn't matter how pretty or how user friendly it is. If it's not fitting the way someone works, where they're at when they need the process or the tool. So that would be my sense, that syndrome of, oh, we got to have something new has created all these layers and all these places that end users are just overwhelmed. Too much stuff, too many ways to get into it.
So that is really interesting what you just said, especially for me being a people analytics person, because what I'm hearing is that, first off, there are real business drivers here to look at some of maybe the technology we take for granted, right? Not the shiny new stuff necessarily. I mean, that's always fun, but it's a lot easier to just say, I'm going to buy this one new thing and put it in, as opposed to, let me go and revisit the foundation of everything I do and potentially change that. That's a really hard thing to do. Like your payroll system, everybody gets affected by that. It's high risk. Your HCM system, high risk. So it's a lot harder to focus on that. But what I'm also hearing is that the real thing we should be articulating is the business value of doing that. And one of the big ones is the value of the data, as opposed to just living with the data as a consequence that you just have to deal with, like the weather. No, we can actually have an objective. We can have a requirement that says we need data to come out in a certain way because it's actually an asset that we need to leverage. I need to see costs and financial numbers alongside all the HR activities I do. I need to be able to quantify the impact of what everyone is doing. If these are the requirements that go in front end, then does that cause us to have a new view of what kind of systems we have in place and not have to live with something just because it's been there all along and it's what we've got in place?
Yeah. Dino, you explained it perfectly well, right? That it is so often that we just assume, like we think of reporting as just another functionality. It's not another functionality, right? It's the output. It's the outcome, right? It's the piece that everybody sees. Same thing with data analytics in any of our tools. Same thing with, how someone gathers data, right? You think about, okay, I've got a pretty screen, but does it gather the data in the way that we know it needs to gather the data because it has to pull it into a system that then has to do something with it, right? We think of all of that as not as important as the process or the sort of overall functionality. And I think that's the thing. I am seeing some of that change. It's interesting. You'll get some really savvy HR tech buyers now who are like, I do a use case, and in that use case, I want to see exactly what my output will look like, right? Those are the kind of things, we're starting to see end users realize that, they have been through the pain of having an environment where it didn't quite come out the way they want to, or they would have to manipulate it 10 times over to get it to where they're at. Now, the other thing I think, though, is that, your conversation about outcomes and value, that's the other, I think, big hype thing that's going on in the HR and HR technology space right now, is the idea that there is a best practice or a way to do human resources. Human resource is a business function, and it is in the service to some extent of what the business is trying to achieve, but with an outcome it's trying to achieve through the employees. And so every company should have a very unique approach to HR, because every company has a unique approach to doing their business. And if they all have a unique approach to HR, that means that they have tools that will help them get there. But no two HR technology ecosystem that I've ever analyzed has ever been exactly the same. And I think that's the other hype, is that we have this perfect picture in our head of what an HR tech environment looks like. And we keep trying to get to it instead of really looking at, are we meeting our goals, right?
So I hear you, and I want to agree with you, but I also am scared of what you're saying, because what I'm hearing is then, well, wait a minute, that becomes pretty hard, right? Like, if I always like to compare HR to accounting and finance, right? Especially in the analytics world, that's a pretty natural space that I always end up, because we have lots of reports on our financial situation. We have lots of metrics on what's going on with our money. And we very rarely have the same depth and quality of analysis on what's happening with our workforce. The reason for that, or at least one of the reasons, is we have a whole discipline built up around finance, right? You can go to school for accounting. You can get your MBA. There is an established vocabulary and language for how we describe the financial situation of an organization. We don't have that same vocabulary on the HR side. There is no established set of metrics, for example, that tell the full story of a workforce. Yes, we have turnover. Everybody looks at turnover, but even turnover doesn't mean the same thing to every company. And for some, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a good thing if you have to manage your labor costs. So there isn't really that same pantheon of items that we can draw from when we look at the HR world, which makes it kind of daunting. How do you embark on a technology selection if you have to come up with all these requirements from scratch? It's not like you can read an article and say, well, this is what we should be looking for. It requires a lot more introspection, a lot more thought. And I don't know if a lot of companies have that. How do you guide a company that is about to embark on a selection of a technology like a new payroll or a new HCM that is so risky and all-encompassing, and still have it be driven by something meaningful and not just, well, we want to have a nicer user interface? I mean, that's good. It's good to have a nicer user interface, but is there more?
Yeah, well, you've opened up quite a few topics there. So first off, on the finance,
Sorry.
yeah, that's okay. well, but I think the finance conversation is really intriguing, right? Because we forget that the general accepted accounting practices started as a conversation after the 1920s crash, right? The stock market. And it didn't really get solidified until 1973, I think was the actual number. And then the international ones, I think, followed after that not too long. And so what you're seeing there is almost 100 years of conversation and discussion about what's important in the finance space. And even as we have generally accepted accounting practices, we're now coming up with even new models, right, about how that's done. And everyone who does finance and marketing and any of those would realize that there are reporting and accepted labels and definitions, but you each do little different ways of running finance inside of an organization, right? You have to, right? Because every business model is a little different. And I think, first of all, HR needs to give itself a little bit of grace. We've been talking about HR at most for about 50 years in the industry, really. Before that, it was a personnel underneath some management function. As a human resource business model organization, it really has been about 50 to 55 years in the market. And in that 50 years, what we have started to do is to start to talk about what are the standards. And we're starting to get some of that. And the new human capital management reporting that's being required by the government in the United States. We're starting to see that in Europe with the European roundtables starting to have some standards around what terms like engagement and FTE mean, right? It is happening, but slowly. And so I think, first of all, we have to understand that as HR professionals, we want to be ahead of that curve. We want to look at all the things that the market is starting to do from a regulations and a standards perspective and say, okay, if we're ahead of that, if we're looking at the ISO standards, what would that look like in our company? That's reporting and regulations and making sure we're speaking the same language. How we practice HR, the approach we take to human resources, that's a conversation about what's important to our organization. If you're an organization that says that you're Google and your focus is on, they've gotten rid of the we do no evil, but their focus now, I think, is on openness and ethics and data in the market, right? Well, then your practices for HR should probably rethink how you address your ethics and artificial intelligence teams, management, right? We oftentimes disengage what we're trying to achieve as an organization from the people side of the conversation. We make it about headcount, or we make it about everyone has the same process, or best practices that everyone should have a benefit that's a foos table inside of the organization, right? Instead of thinking every human being is not a dollar or a box like supply chain or marketing, they are a human being that has different needs and requirements and personalizations. And the business has goals. How do I create an HR technology environment that figures out my business goals that meets my personal employees' workforce needs? And the way to do that is to really start with your business strategy, figure out what's the most important, critical, big rocks in that business strategy, dive down into those as to what human resource elements are going to make the biggest impact on that, and make those your use cases when you're looking at these replacements or buying new tools and technologies. It sounds simple, but it's a really difficult thing, because that means you have to be clear about what your business is trying to achieve.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And it makes me think that If you're waiting until you want to buy a piece of technology to have that conversation, you're missing the boat. You need to be having that conversation regularly and making sure that your, I don't even want to say vision. It sounds like it's more specific than that, that what you're really about, what you're trying to achieve in HR is aligned with the business. And that needs to be a continuous conversation that happens. So if at some point you decide you want to change your payroll system, you're already really clear about what you want to be as an organization and where your system or processes are not keeping up. If you wait until the actual purchase, it's such a rush. There's so much pressure, and everything devolves down into how many buttons am I clicking on? And, can I recreate the process I had before, which it's kind of missing the whole point, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah. I mean, a really solid example of this is take a large organization that says that their goal is maybe it's just to be the number one consulting firm in their industry. We'll just sort of make it a broad one, right? But their industry is their industry is doing consulting in the space around aerospace. Well, when you think about that being your goal, then you have to sort of take that down to what are the type of employees that we need to work in this industry? What is the engagement we need of those employees? What is the compensation level we need to have for those employees? What is the onboarding process we need when we know our goal is to be the number one consulting firm in aerospace in this organization, right? And then you take a look at your payroll and, well, how does that tie to it? Well, if I'm hiring the highest level engineers in my organization, and I know that those engineers are highly detailed in how they look at things like paychecks, because that's how an engineer thinks, I better make sure that my payroll system has a view for them that they can clearly, that kind of thing doesn't seem like it's important. But if you really understand the workers and the employees and the personal needs of those employees in your organization, you will find that there are some things inside of payroll that are more important than the process, but it's all about sort of what does that look like on the employee's end. You've got to make sure that you have the regulatory pieces. That's a first level requirement. But to your point, after that, I should know already the kind of workforce I have, the demographics, the shifts I need to make before I'm starting to make that payroll decision, right? So yeah.
That's interesting. So really, instead of focusing so much on what does it need to do, and maybe even less on how is it doing it, we need to go all the way back and say, wait, who are we? And who is this for? And what, I don't know if the word is feeling, but how do we want people to experience how we engage with them? What is that feeling that those engineers have when they get their paycheck or when they go through the onboarding process? Engagement not as a survey that's done periodically, but rather as an outcome of every interaction an employee has with a corporate.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's what we're really talking about. You could have a really great day at work, and then you have to fill out a timesheet. I'm not speaking specifically at all here, David, about the timesheet I do. I have to fill out a timesheet, and suddenly I'm leaving the day a little frustrated because it was difficult. And suddenly all that goodwill is balanced out, right? I loved doing my timesheet, David. But anyway, the point is thinking about that person and how do we support them through our systems and our processes, because that's really what HR is about. We're not a tax on the organization. We're there to help make the organization achieve its goals. How are we doing that through every system that we have? And can that be front-ended into the decision for this stuff and not have it just be a spreadsheet of ticks of specific little pieces of functionality? That is important, but it needs to be balanced with this as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's often what gets lost in these conversations. We put a big bucket on user experience, but we don't think about what that user experience is trying to achieve, right? So it's pretty buttons or it feels right, but maybe the engineer wants to see everything in a spreadsheet, or maybe the engineer, or maybe you're trying to get more women in your environment. When we talk about social injustice, when we talk about systemic biases, that has to go really deep. Those are in our payroll and our benefit systems in ways we don't even think about sometimes, in the fact that maybe it always provides your paycheck in an email. Well, if I don't have a personal email, if I'm not a person who has access to a computer every day, what does that mean about me being able to access and see my paycheck, right? That means I almost never see it. It goes right into maybe a bank or it goes right into a check cashing card. I have no concept of how all those pieces work together. We really have to think about those kind of things when we're building out our HR technology conversation, and that we have to think about the workforce and the human beings. Your other point, though, I think, which is, the spreadsheets and the tick boxes, I'm not saying that that you don't have some level of that when you're doing implementation. There's a practical component of selection that requires that I have to know that it will meet the basic functionality that I need. But in the market that we're in today, 80% of the systems do about 80% of the same things. So if you are looking at HR technology, you make sure that it does your features, your functionality required for your business and for your industry from a regulatory perspective. It's that 20% that makes a difference as to whether or not that HR technology is adopted.
So, question for you on that, though, Stacey. Is 80% then too big? Could there be the need for having more directed functionality that would help specific industries and specific user groups? For example, those people in retail who do not have their own email addresses, who live paycheck to paycheck. Let's think of waiters, waitresses, bus people, who they get that card that they get paid on now, and that's their link to the business because there literally is no other way. And whether they show up tomorrow is based on faith that the restaurant or the retail organization has. Is there a reason why there shouldn't be specific HR technology towards specific groups so that they then can deal with those issues?
Yeah, this is a constant conversation in the industry. How much do I tailor my HR technology to an industry? The vendors themselves, I mean, as you guys know, you're in this space a little bit, this whole industry-specific conversation. And I've watched many organizations go down the road and try and tailor systems towards a specific industry and oftentimes get lost in the weeds. So I wish I had a really good answer on this for you. I don't know that I have seen a lot of organizations who have been able to pivot from doing a general platform that fits across the market to a more tailored industry specific platform effectively. We've seen a lot of industry specific platforms expand a little bit to cover other industries, but they oftentimes can't go generally because they don't have the capacity, right, to do that. Here's what I'm starting to see happen in the market. Right. And I think this is exactly the space for the small and the newer technologies, right? I think this area of innovation. So to your point, if I have a payroll system that automatically always sends something to a email and our organization doesn't, or most of my employees don't have a personal email, well, is there another solution, a small solution that automatically turns all those emails into text messages, right? In a way that's engaging. I think that's the space for innovation in our market, is that those small businesses, and eventually they will maybe get bought if it feels like it fits into an organization's ecosystem over time. But I see so many great ways that organizations are coming up with amazing industry-specific, what you would call add-ons, right, in our market. I think that's where I'm seeing that work from what so far, at least. And I don't think there's a surefire answer on this particular question.
So there's a lot of bottom-up that has to come into this process where companies are able to, I don't know if they have to build their own thing, but at least customize some of their systems to their flavor and their culture. And really be able to challenge a orthodoxy perhaps for an industry to say, no, we're going to do things a little differently. And that's okay because it works for us. And they need to choose technologies and tools that offer a bit of flexibility in that area.
Yeah, so the ability to do really solid integrations, the ability to have configuration that's easy to understand over complex configuration can be really, really hard for a small business or a mid-market business. So some of the large systems are almost too complex for them. I'm a big proponent in the market that there is a vendor and a system for everyone, and for every vendor and system, there's a perfect customer, right? So which is why we have an open market. There's no one vendor that is going to be perfect for every organization. And because HR is trying to be a business because HR is an organization that is supporting a business outcome, they should be looking for that vendor that most closely aligns with the culture and the outcomes they're trying to achieve. And then, yes, there will always be some configuration, some addition, some element. You're not going to get a single platform. That is, I think we've all come to that agreement. There is no single platform conversation that makes sense in this market. What there is, though, is that you might have a series of ecosystems. So you might have one vendor who has multiple partners, and that vendor with all those partners makes a lot more sense for you than another vendor with a different set of partners, right? So looking at their partners, looking at their culture, looking at their long-term goals are also important when you're doing HR technology selection in the space. Yeah.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by Turetsky Consulting and listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
So, Dino, how would you summarize the conversation today?
I don't know if I can summarize it. My mind is expanding, but I will give it a try. I think there's several themes that have come out. One for me was definitely question the fundamentals. The systems that we have in place, that we may have had in place for a long time, payroll, HR, all that stuff, if it's not aligned with our culture and who we want to be, it's okay. This is the time to question that. But we've got to be clear about who we are as an organization and drive that through in all of our systems.
Dino, I think yes. I mean, that's one of the things that we're seeing, in the market. You've done a great job of sort of synthesizing those couple of comments. But I think that the really important thing is to think about the fact that HR technology and the work around it and the approach that we're taking as an industry and as a market is we're trying to create an outcome for our organizations and for our employees. Those two things go hand in hand. And so as an HR technologist, as an HRIS professional, as an HR data analytics professional, as any of those professionals out there who are working on all of this, the real goal is to understand your business and to understand your workforce. If you can take those two things into consideration, the decisions you make will make sense. So that's my big, takeaway from our conversation is, yes, you've got to know your vision. Yes, you've got to understand the fundamental thing your business is trying to achieve. Yes, you've got to know your workforce, its demographics, the shifts you want to make, the culture, and you've got to understand how all that fits with every technology that you're making a selection around. But make that through the lens of your workforce and your business outcomes, and I think you'll make good decisions. So don't get too caught up in, am I doing it the right way? Just follow the process, and if you do it through that lens, you'll end up with an outcome I think will appreciate.
So thank you very much, Stacey. Thank you, Dino. Really appreciate both of you joining.
Thanks. It was fun.
Yeah, I had a great time. Your audience, looking forward to hearing feedback on the session. It was good and fun talking to you guys.
I'm sure we're going to get some great feedback. And thank you guys for listening. And if you like today's episode, please hit subscribe. And if you know somebody who might also enjoy it, please send it their way. We'd appreciate it. And if you have any feedback, please go to turetskyconsulting.com/podcast and leave us some comments. Thank you very much for listening to the HR Data Labs. Please stay safe.
That was HR Data Labs. Please visit turetskyconsulting.com/podcast to review the show, add comments about this episode, or add new ideas about upcoming shows you'd like to hear. Feel free to be creative, but please be nice. Thank you for joining us this week on the HR Data Labs podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.